Hey, Armen.
Hey Michael, how are you?
Uh, well, I'm okay, I guess, but I felt like, when I saw or was reading the headlines, that stuff's going on over in Armenia and Azerbaijan, that I felt like. And last episode we talked about, we would maybe talk more about the Sultan and maybe talk about how Soghomon Tehlirian is the Armenian Forrest Gump, but I think we should put that off and just devote this episode at least to just kind of wading through what's going on currently on that in that part of the world with this conflict. What do you think?
I think I can do that. Yeah, I
All
should
right.
be up to the task.
So you're obviously closer to these things than I am, and that's why I want to do this. I've got a couple articles here from today, today being Monday, so this will probably be posted by Tuesday or maybe even by the end of Monday. But so this is as current as I can get on what's going on over there. I just randomly picked like one article from CBS News and one article from The Hill, I guess. And so I'll just read the first couple paragraphs, and then I'm also going to read a little bit on Wikipedia from just a little snippet of the historical background of where this conflict first, I guess, technically first arose. So let me just read the CBS, maybe 3 or 4 paragraphs. This is from today, October 5th, 2020. This was posted at 10:40 a.m. The title is Why Armenia and Azerbaijan Are Fighting and Why It Could Get Uglier. This is Dateline Moscow. Dozens of people have reportedly been killed and hundreds more wounded since fighting erupted between Azerbaijan and Armenia just over a week ago. The two countries' military forces are clashing over the Azerbaijani breakaway territory of Nagorno-Karabakh. Is that how it's pronounced?
As always with you, it's close enough.
Can you pronounce it for me?
So it's a hybrid word of Russian and Persian. So it's Nagorny Karabakh, I guess would be the
Nagorno-Karabakh?
yeah.
All right. Because obviously I'm going to have to pronounce that multiple times. So I just want to get that right. There's plenty of other things I'll butcher, but that one I want to get right. It's a territory called Nagorno-Karabakh. Let me reread that last sentence. The two countries' military forces are clashing over the Azerbaijani breakaway territory of Nagorno-Karabakh, and with some major world powers backing opposing sides in the standoff, and the U.S. notably absent, there are concerns the conflict could escalate. I'm going to skip down. There's a little map here that shows what is the dispute. It shows a map of the area. Armenia in dark gray, Azerbaijan in a lighter gray, and the Nagorno-Karabakh region in red. Armenia and Azerbaijan both used to be part of the Soviet Union, but since that crumbled, the new borders have remained in dispute. When Soviet communist rule was nearing its end in the late 1980s, the mountainous region of Nagorno-Karabakh's autonomous legislature voted to join Armenia. As the Soviet Union dissolved, Nagorno-Karabakh proclaimed its independence, which led to a war with tens of thousands of casualties. It has not been recognized by any other country as an independent state. I'm going to jump just briefly over to this other article in The Hill. The state urges immediate ceasefire in clash between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And this seems, I don't know, you can tell me, but this seems to conflict just a little bit with one of the assertions in the other article. This is the first paragraph, Deputy Secretary of State, and this is the United States Secretary of State, I think. Oh yeah, the U.S. Deputy Secretary of State, Steve Begun, I don't know, I can't pronounce it, but on Monday he spoke separately with the foreign ministers of Azerbaijan and Armenia and urged an immediate ceasefire and return to negotiations amid escalating fighting between the two sides that erupted over the contested area of Nagorno-Karabakh. Azerbaijan expressed deep concern over reports of the escalation of military action and expanding theater of operations. In over a week of fighting between the two sides, State Department spokesperson Morgan Ortagus said in a statement. The Deputy Secretary stressed to the foreign ministers that there is no military solution to the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, Ortagus said. The Deputy Secretary urged both sides to return to negotiations under the Minsk Group, a mediating effort co-chaired by the United States, Russia, and France, and part of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. I won't continue reading that. It just seems like the one article said the U.S. was not involved, and this looks like the U.S. is involved, but I don't know. Let me just read one last thing before I probe you. I just pulled up Wikipedia. I know people hate to hear Wikipedia is unreliable or whatever, but under the section Nagorno-Karabakh War is what I looked up, and there's a lot of history, and it seems to go back all the way back to pretty much the era that we've been talking about on this podcast. But let me just read this background section, two little sections. Background: the territorial ownership of Nagorno-Karabakh today is heavily contested between Armenians and Azerbaijanis. The current conflict has its roots in events following World War I. Shortly before the Ottoman Empire's capitulation in the war, the Russian Empire collapsed in November of 1917 and fell under the control of the Bolsheviks. The three nations of the Caucasus, Armenians, Azerbaijanis, and Georgians, previously under the rule of the Russian Empire, declared the formation of the Transcaucasian Federation, which dissolved after only 3 months of existence. And then the next section, brief section, talks about war between these states. Fighting soon broke out between the First Republic of Armenia and the Azerbaijan Democratic Republic in 3 specific regions. It lists those regions. Armenia and Azerbaijan quarreled about the putative boundaries of the 3 provinces. The Karabakh Armenians attempted to declare their independence but failed to make contact with the Republic of Armenia. Following the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in World War I, Armenian General Andranik Ozanian entered Karabakh with military success and was headed towards the regional capital of Shusha in December of 1918. British troops occupied the South Caucasus in 1919, and the British command suggested Andranik cease his offensive and allow the conflict to be solved at the Paris Peace Conference. Afterwards, the British provisionally agreed to Azerbaijani statesman Khosrow Bey Sultanov's appointment as provisional governor, but insisted that a final decision on the territory's ownership should be decided only at a future. Okay, so that's the ancient history, or the early history of this conflict, and then it goes on during the Soviet Union. These were all Soviet territories, and then the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then the conflict came back in earnest. So tell me, Armen, anything I've read that you need to expound upon, or what's going on right now? Let me hear it.
No, that captures everything then.
That's all you have to say?
I mean, it's like more like the question is like, where do you begin? And, I'm not sure if my phone is able to record or has enough storage to record the entire history of this period, even if it is just in a much more limited form. So you may want to ask me a much more directed question.
Yes, here's the much more directed question. Geopolitics is always a hot potato, right? I mean, that's the term you used in a text to me. It's such a hot potato issue. And I know it's obviously hits home with a lot of people on both sides of the conflict. Maybe you can just elaborate on that. What do you talk about what the issues are as far as why it's hot potato? like you risk ostracizing yourself by even stating facts. Is that true?
Well, let me just say two things from the beginning. First, my specialty is not the Soviet Union or the history of the republics that once made up the Soviet Union after it collapsed in 1991. So I don't speak on the subject with any level of authority, and people are more than welcome to correct me if I've misinterpreted certain facts or versions of the story, and I hope I can be forgiven for that. But because I've read so much on empires and nationalism, I feel like maybe I can comment on this with some level of authority. And my second point would be to what you were just saying, that yes, this is something which is very much a polarizing matter. And for both, as you said, like for both peoples on the side of conflict, they will cling to their beliefs and their positions very passionately and vehemently. And the reason why it is so, why there so much emotions really do erupt from the conflict, is because it's been going on for close on 30 years. And you were reading the history from the period before the end of the First World War, and perhaps that's when you really can go back to it and see why we are where we are at this current moment. But when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Armenia and Azerbaijan became independent republics, but not everybody in Azerbaijan, that is the Armenians who live in this region called Nagorno-Karabakh, wanted to continue to live there. Under the Soviet leadership for close on 70 years, many Armenians in Karabakh were dissatisfied with the policies that the Soviet Azerbaijani government implemented. They felt that their cultural rights were being repressed, and they felt that their ability to continue to live in that region would no longer be sustainable if they were to be a part of Azerbaijan. So one point on statistics may be one way of them trying to demonstrate that. In 1920 or so, this region had a population that was about 95% Armenian, and over the next 70 years, it dropped pretty precipitously down to about 75% Armenian and about 25% Azerbaijani. And there was this real fear that by the time the USSR was disintegrating, that trend would continue. And rather than go down that path, the Armenians in Karabakh decided to wage a struggle to gain their own independence. And after 3 years, from about 1991 to 1994, they were able to break free and establish their own unrecognized state, it should be said, but at the very least establish their own state, which would not necessarily be, it's not a part of Armenia. It's at the very least at this moment, it's considered its own, has its own government, it has its own coat of arms and its own army. But a ceasefire was concluded in 1994, and it's held in place for 30 years. There's been outbreaks of violence for all this time, but because of the fact that Azerbaijan never reconciled itself with the loss of Nagorno-Karabakh, it's always threatened to take it back. And what we're seeing in the headlines now, and especially in this last week, is definitely the most serious manifestation of this effort to reclaim this region by Azerbaijan's government.
So essentially, it's a territory that has claimed statehood or is self-identified as a, not necessarily a part of Armenia, but its own independence, and that's never been recognized. Has it been recognized by any other nation, or is just Armenia?
No, even Armenia does not recognize formally, at least Nagorno-Karabakh state. There are a few unrecognized states that recognize it. So Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which are regions that are in Georgia, that is not in the United States, but the Armenia's northern neighbor, Georgia. These regions were essentially broke free from Georgia during the 2008 war and afterward between Georgia and Russia, and they're considered separatist states or unrecognized states, but they've extended recognition of Nagorno-Karabakh, but no other country else has at this moment.
Got it. So, I mean, in my research, my newfound love of history over the past 3 years and working on this project, it's opened my eyes to really the global, it's opened my eyes to geopolitics in a new way. I mean, wars are always about territory, fighting over land and who gets to own what, and so this is one of those scenarios where to compare and contrast to another such instance. I always grew up believing there's this country called Taiwan, or this island nation called Taiwan, and then it turns out, it's actually my own ignorance. It's only recently that I realized that China does not consider Taiwan its own nation. And so that's an example where Taiwan has been recognized by some countries, but China itself says, no, that's part of us. And so this would be a similar case, would it? Like Azerbaijan is like, no, that's always been part of Azerbaijan. And those in Nagorno-Karabakh would say, no, we've been this territory and we've been functioning. I mean, have they functioned independently pretty much in the past 100 years?
They being Azerbaijan or
Nagorno-Karabakh.
So in the beginning of the 20th century, this region was still a part of the Russian Empire. It was an administrative unit within the Russian Empire. And it wasn't until 1917 that, well, more like 1918, that there was this clash or this struggle over this region when, as you were reading again on the article from Wikipedia, Armenia and Azerbaijan declared their independence in May 1918, but they are unable to come to an amicable agreement on where their borders should lie at this time. And May 1918 and well into 1919, as we both know, was when the First World War was drawing to an end, and also the Paris Peace Conference commences in January of the following year. And there was this belief that both sides would be able to present their arguments to the Allied powers at Paris, and they would then adjudicate the borders. But that never actually did happen because both of these countries, as well as Georgia, were incorporated into the USSR. So Nagorno-Karabakh just happened to be one of these flashpoint regions where Armenia, Azerbaijan, these two first republics clashed over and were never really able to definitively establish their legal claims. And once the USSR came in, it decided to resolve the matter as it saw fit.
So it kind of fell through the cracks. I mean, we talked about the Paris Peace Accord in the past and how the Treaty of Versailles resolved a bunch of stuff, but there were other treaties that were never ratified, and this is another one of those things that never got resolved officially on the world stage.
Right. Right.
Well, I don't want to go on too long about this. I want to dedicate this episode to this issue, and I want to probably revisit this regularly. So in this last section here, can you just briefly explain what the events that led to this current conflict? Just the facts on the ground, what happened to start to basically stir this up again?
Well, again, this is something which political analysts will be able to put much better than I can. So the best I can do is summarize their findings. So as I mentioned, this ceasefire that was concluded in 1994 ended with the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh essentially asserting their control over the region and several regions outside of the former borders of the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous District, which was this administrative unit that was within the borders of Soviet Azerbaijan until 1991. And negotiations have always gone back and forth, and neither side has been able to come to a point where they can both agree and say this is what looks like a sustainable, lasting, the basis of a sustainable, lasting peace between our two sides. And as I mentioned, the ceasefire is held more or less along the line of contact. There's always been violations, but in the last 5-10 years, it seems as if Azerbaijan's grown more and more weary of the negotiation process, and its leaders have always threatened to start a conflict once again, and in order to gain the territories by force. And what we're seeing now again is the most serious effort by it in order to affect that reality. With the United States, I think this is what another analyst was saying, distracted by the elections this year and with nobody really able to restrain either side from carrying out military operations. This is what we've gotten. This is what we're witnessing right now, and the fact that Turkey is also involved very much on Azerbaijan's side is what's extremely disconcerting to international observers, because this had not necessarily been the case previously, but now it's a much more explicit form of support that people are seeing and reading about. And also the intensity of the conflict is, I think, what's very striking. It's in the early 1990s, you had, of course, tanks and artillery dueling it out against each other, but now you have much more advanced weaponry that both sides have, including tanks, artillery, multiple rocket launchers, and unmanned aerial vehicles, and that is leading to devastation on a scale which perhaps would not have been possible 25-30 years ago. And you're seeing how it's being played out in the battlefield with, and not just only on the battlefield, but also in places in Nagorno-Karabakh where towns and cities are being indiscriminately shelled. So it is a very tense situation, and I think the best we can hope for is peace to come fast and soon. I hope we don't have to do a segment on this again, to be quite honest.
Well, when I first heard about this, like the first thing I read is like Armenia shot down a couple helicopters and destroyed a couple, like 3 tanks or something. But I imagine it's escalated beyond that, or I mean, that's just the first thing I read, that there were helicopters shot down and tanks destroyed.
Yeah, there's combat taking place all along the borders of Nagorno-Karabakh with Azerbaijan, and it's still, everything seems to still be hidden behind the fog of war. So at the very least, once the dust settles, hopefully we'll have a much better idea of what happened and what the full implications of this war will be, both on the local stage with Armenia and Azerbaijan and on a regional and international level.
Well, what we can all agree upon is escalation is the worst possible, the worst possible outcome. And so, like the international community is involved. The State Department in the U.S. seems to be on, at least paying attention. I don't think the United States is supposed to be the world police, but if there's the potential for a greater escalation and other countries getting involved, we don't want that. We don't want armed conflict at all. So, all right. I think that's enough for this episode, but I do also want to say, to those of you watching, we've got coming up a series of interviews. We've already got one in the can. Actually, Armen, why don't you describe or introduce? I'm going to post that part one of the interview with your professor. Who is it, and what is the subject matter?
So I'm assuming this is going to be the next episode that will
Yep.
be uploaded after the
Yep.
one that we record.
After this one.
Right. So our first guest on the show will be Professor James Shadell, who is a historian of Austria and also Central Europe at Georgetown University. And we were very lucky to speak to him a few weeks ago on the subject of Austria-Hungary and the region itself, and on empires and nations more generally. So I think people will be very excited to listen to it and gain a better understanding of that period.
Yeah, it's going to be. I'm going to break it up into 2 episodes. It's really a really concentrated survey of the history of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, I would say. It's like sitting in a college lecture. I mean, there's a college professor, and in fact, he has a book coming out that covers all this material. So we got to get a real concentrated lecture or insight into some of the most fascinating aspects of a piece of history that most people don't know anything about. It was particularly, I was surprised because my heritage, my dad's side, the Gavlak side, all come from that part of the world. And so I was learning about my own heritage just by listening to him. So that was a bonus for me. All right. Any final words in this episode, Armen?
No.
All right. Signing off. So I'm going to be posting that pretty soon. Within a week, I'll post the first part of the professor's guest session with us. So stay tuned for that. Bye, everybody.